Welcome to the Digital Health Hackers podcast, where we go over innovators in healthcare doing exciting stuff. And today I have Darren Devitt with me. And the way I actually discovered about you was through your blog. And you've been putting out a lot of articles on FHIR. You've been very active on LinkedIn, and I've been reading a lot of your blog articles as well. They've been really good. And then I discovered that you have this tool called Vanya and Vanya Labs, which has been building this. So I was intrigued. So this is a FHIR viewer, and it can connect to multiple FHIR servers. So I thought I need to get to the person who's working on this. And so here we are. So Darren, please go ahead, introduce yourself to the audience.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Siddharth. Yeah, so I'm Darren Devitt. I'm a software engineer. I've been a software engineer for about 20 something years. And I've been working with healthcare data for the last 3 years, I would say. And mostly with FHIR, also a little bit of HL7 in there too, and a little bit of DICOM as well. So as Siddharth mentioned, I've been posting regularly on LinkedIn as well and on my blog on FHIR-related topics. Usually I pick a small little topic and try and explain it in a bit more detail to make it easier to understand. And a lot of people seem to appreciate that. Also, as Siddharth mentioned, I've been working on a tool called Vanya, which is a FHIR viewer. And yeah, that's me basically.
So you've been working as a consultant for multiple companies, and you've been consulting specifically on FHIR, correct?
Yeah, so I'm a contractor / consultant. I've worked for health insurance companies in the US, medtech companies, Europe and the US. I do short and long-term consulting and contracting projects depending on what's required. So I'll come in usually as the FHIR expert or the person who has more knowledge of FHIR than the team does. So something I found almost from day one is that FHIR is growing so fast that there are so many teams out there filled with developers who just don't have any prior exposure to FHIR and quite often don't have any exposure to even healthcare data itself. So these teams need someone with some kind of extra knowledge to kind of guide the teams as they start out on a project or highlight some things they need to be aware of as the project matures.
Yeah, absolutely. I think FHIR is relatively new, and a lot of people are getting more used to it as just, okay, it's another API, it's another data structure. But where did you see the gap when you were especially in a consulting role? Where did you see the gap with other teams? What did they not understand about FHIR the most?
Well, the very first contract I worked on FHIR with was with the US health insurance company. They were doing a big project to do with a genomics clinical trial. And it was a small team, despite the size of the project, and I was brought in as the back-end developer. So I was building the kind of .NET API that interacted with FHIR and passed the data onto a front-end app. And I had no prior exposure to FHIR, so I was learning on the job as well. And I had assumed when I joined the team that the gaps in my knowledge would be filled by the team. But that wasn't the case. Nobody else there had knowledge either. So I was very much learning from the FHIR documentation. We were using Farley's SDK, the C# SDK, so I was learning from their documentation as well, how to make calls to FHIR and so on. This particular case, we were using Azure's managed FHIR server, so to my mind, it looked very much like a database, even though it wasn't, because we were saving data directly into the FHIR instance. It wasn't functioning as a facade. There was no, say, underlying database that we owned that we could see. So to me, it was at first glance and my first approach to it, it was a very unusual way of storing data. But that, I think, was more down to the way it was set up and the way these managed FHIR servers work. So they're kind of databases, but not databases, which can be very confusing to developers who haven't seen this before.
Yeah, I think it's a very funny statement that you made, that you came in and you expected the other people to know, they expected you to know, and you had to learn everything. And coming back to this point about people looking at a FHIR server as a database versus as an API layer or just a facade. A lot of people, when they are moving, they have this confusion about what exactly is FHIR. And I think the different paradigms that HL7 has introduced with FHIR doesn't help here. So just for the audience who are looking at it, so when Azure FHIR, it's a managed service by Microsoft Azure, and you can use that, you can spin up your own FHIR server and you can store data, you can do all CRUD operations on it. It is a managed API, and that is what Darren came into contact with first in that particular project. So it can be used as a database, it can be used as a storage mechanism as well.
Yeah, I think this is particularly important when, say, it's a brand new project and people don't have prior experience at FHIR. So a brand new project, normally there isn't an underlying database. You're creating a brand new database, whether it's SQL Server or Postgres. But in this case, it was actually FHIR. So the bulk of your data was going into FHIR. So what I tended to notice with the first company I worked with, FHIR for, and also in later companies, is that developers tend then to treat that as a real database. So quite often you end up seeing data in there that shouldn't really be in there. So they try and force data that they were put into a regular database into FHIR in some convoluted way, probably using extensions or misusing string fields.
Always, yeah. It's always extensions.
Yes.
And so that's where again, as a database, you at least have these database viewers. You can at least explore the data that you are putting in. How was it with FHIR back when you were getting started?
Yeah, with FHIR it was Postman, basically. So I got my first couple of weeks on the job, I was saying, well, what's the best way to access this data? How do we see it? And everyone was saying Postman. That's all you can do. You write a request in Postman, you run your GET request, you parse through the data, and so on. And this was particularly not a great way to do it for this particular project because, like I mentioned earlier, it was a clinical trial project. So we were heavily using the questionnaire and questionnaire response resources in FHIR, which are very large resources. And typically, you could run a GET request to get, say, the last 20 questionnaire response resources, and you could find yourself getting back 70,000 lines of JSON. So it's very, very difficult as a developer writing code, testing his code, to look through those 70,000 lines of JSON to find if one value in one resource was updated correctly. So around that time, I kind of came up with the idea for Vanya. I first went looking for a desktop tool of some kind, like SQL Server Management Studio or DB Visualizer to fill that gap. I thought there would be one. I mean, FHIR is reasonably mature, it's 10 years old. I thought there'd be some tooling out there that would allow this. But there were no standalone tools. There were some tools built into larger enterprise products, like some of these very big products would have similar tools inside. I know Google GCP has a FHIR viewer as well as part of their suite of tools, but they're not standalone. You can't connect them up to any other FHIR server and use them. So that's where the idea for Vanya came from. I thought, developers need this. We need a quick way to see the data we're working with. It might not be a polished application. It doesn't need to be something you can run intensive queries on production servers on, but something you can run on dev servers or local host servers to help you along, really.
Yeah, so let's take it for a spin. I'm sharing your screen as well right now.
Okay, so the screen you're seeing now is basically the homepage, which is a list of servers in the middle. You can see the HAPI server that everyone knows, my own local host server, and the Vanya Labs test server, which is actually an Azure FHIR server that I set up about a year ago and populated with some data from Cynthia. So on the left, you can see down here in the second half of the screen, the list of all 145 or 4 resources in alphabetical order. And above that, you see the recently accessed list of resources. So I put this in because my experience on different projects was that most teams will be working on only a small subset of FHIR resources. They might use 10 or 15 throughout the project and maybe 5 or 6 over the course of a day or a week or a sprint and so on. So by having the recent ones up here, it's very quick to see what you're doing. So I'll show you straight away some of the resources. So let me just click on the encounter resource here. This brings us into the current server, which is the Vanya Labs test server. Mm-hmm. And what it does is it shows in the grid section here the most recently updated resources in update order. So the very first resource should be the one you just updated if you are writing code and testing code. And I've singled out some of the elements, like 5 or 6 elements that I think are the more significant ones for Encounter. And you can click on these. And on the right, you see basically all the data in plain text format. So participants, subject, that's the patient, service provider, the hospital. The type here, which is urgent care clinic, is fleshed out here. That's the codable concept. And also we have a JSON tab, which if this isn't quite good enough for you, you want to drill down into the raw data, you can see it all right here. So very quickly you can jump into the resource you've just updated and see what you want to see. Basically see if the values you were updating have been updated correctly. So it's very easy to jump between resources. We're just opening the observations now, 27,000 of them in there. And again, yeah, very, very simple to see. So if I jump back into the homepage now, we can switch between different FHIR servers very easily as well. So I'll connect now to the HAPI server, the R4 server, and that's us connected. And if we just click on observation at the top, it might take a little longer to load because I think there's a few million observations in the HAPI test server. Anyone who isn't familiar with HAPI, it's probably the biggest test server, publicly accessible test server, FHIR server in the world. So developers all over the world use this. They write code against it. So you see all sorts of things going in there. Some good data, some bad data, usually some data in between. So we have 4.1 million resources, and these are the ones that have just been updated. So it's showing a timestamp of 11:32, which is 10 minutes ago in my time. And you can see just here that we can see, say, a subject with a patient, and we can click on that patient if we want to see that patient and jump straight in, really. So there we can see the patient and a little bit of detail over there on the right. And we just page back to where we were before.
I saw one interesting warning at the top. One resource contains conformance issues.
Yeah, what we're doing here when I'm loading in a page of resources, we're also running conformance checks on R4 to ensure everything is valid. So in this particular case, we have one resource that contains a conformance issue. We should see a little icon next to it. There it is down the bottom. So we click on that. There's quite a lot of errors here, actually. So this particular resource is missing a lot of things. So most of these seem to be cardinality issues. So elements that must be there that are mandatory are not there. So the code isn't there. It's all component code. So the component codes are empty. So if we jump into the JSON, have a quick look. Same errors are there, and down to the components. So it's got the value for each component, but it's missing the code. So the code is mandatory. Code value set. So it's missing a code in every case. So this is probably a developer who's not quite sure what he's doing. He's learning on the job like so many of us do and making a few mistakes. So if we just jump to the next page and see what else we see there.
Again, I think I want to emphasize this point a bit, which is this is actually invalid according to the FHIR R4 spec. It's not specifically a profile, it's invalid according to just FHIR R4. And hapifhir has lenient validation when it's receiving data. So sometimes you can post invalid data to it and it will store it. And as we can see, there are many more resources here which are actually not valid according to FHIR R4.
Yeah, so like you were saying, Siddharth, we're not checking against profiles. This is just the base R4 standard that everything should conform to. And it's not just a case of the HAPI server being a little lenient as well. Most servers that I point this to will have some errors as well. Different errors for different servers. A lot of them are forgiving of cardinality, so they don't always enforce mandatory fields. Some of them, like the HAPI server, are forgiving of invalid, say, date fields. So like for a patient date of birth, they'll accept a date time when they shouldn't. Others are more detailed and granular, like there might be an incorrect value in the value set allowed into a binded element. So you can see all of that here in Vanya. So even if you have quite complicated errors, if it's invalid, you should see it quite clearly here. So let me jump into another resource just to show you some different data. Audit event, and again, a lot of errors. So this is a pattern with test databases, test servers. You see a lot of errors. Hopefully we wouldn't see as many on production servers or regular servers. So again, cardinality problems. Again, all cardinality problems here.
Yeah, but just visually looking at resources like this, it definitely makes a difference, and it helps, quickly identify, okay, these are the different ways in which people are using FHIR, these particular resources as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you're unfamiliar with a particular resource, you might not know for sure which value belongs in a certain element or how that element could be constructed. As we all know, different elements in FHIR can contain different data types, so it's useful to see how different developers are using those different data types. Are they all putting everything into a string? Are some of them storing them as codable concepts and so on? You can see all that when you look at some of the test data here in the HAPI server, or even on the FHIR server as well. The FHIR server has a smaller set of data, but it's to a degree it's kind of richer data as well than the HAPI server because it's used so less. But I would say as well, the viewer like this can give you insights into, say, resources that you don't use very often, like, say, search parameters. So most of us never create search parameters. There might be one person on the team who would do that, or it's done very irregularly. So we might not know how to say construct or construct well, say the FHIR path expression that constructs a search parameter. So you can come onto a site or a server like the HAPI server here and see what other people are putting in for their search parameters. So it's quite interesting to see. And again, a couple of conformance errors up there as well at the top. So some people are not getting it right again. So yeah, cardinality of the URL is missing there, which has to be there. So,
it's pretty invaluable. The fact that this is actually an open server and it's a free tool, Vanya being a free tool, it definitely helps at least in exploring these more unknown resources and how they are used, search parameters with the FHIR paths. It's pretty complex.
It is, yeah. Now, my initial reason for building the tool really was to make a developer's life easier. So I wanted to see data very quickly after I wrote some code. So that kind of use case is fulfilled here. There are extra parts to it. Like, for example, I have a lookup on the identifier or the FHIR ID. So because you can't run a full query in Vanya, you're just seeing resources sorted by last updated date. If you know a particular record you want to see by identifier or by FHIR ID, you can look it up quite quickly. So if we take, say, this value here, someone has a patient identifier of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which is not an MRN number, I'm sure, but let's have a look. Okay, so this is very interesting. This is actually, now this illustrates perfectly why a huge test server like this is not ideal, because we have 17,000 patients with that particular 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 identifier. I'm guessing, looking at the data here, that it's Synthia data, and people are running in the same bundles as post requests, so not being updated, they're going in as new requests. So, yeah, as most of us know, identifiers should be unique for a particular resource. So a patient MRN is an identifier. There should really only be one patient with that MRN. But again, this is a very good way of seeing how valid your data is. You know, are problems creeping in there? Do you have identifiers that exist twice or 3 times for a particular patient? So yeah, that wasn't a very good example to use. But
yeah. But again, this is probably somebody is taking an example FHIR resource from the documentation and just changing the name, changing one field of it and keeping the identifier the same, maybe.
That's, yeah, very, very likely, yes, yeah. So... Okay, so if we jump back to the home screen, I can show you how easy it is, say, to add a new server. We have 3 servers up there already. If I click on the Add New Server button, an open server like the HAPI server with no authentication is very, very simple to add. If I were to add, say, the FHIR server, which again is open as well with no authentication, all I need to do is type in the address of the FHIR server. So I think it's server.phir.ly, I think. And we save that. And let's just connect and see if we can connect. Yeah, that's the correct URL. And see if we can see some data. So there we go. Now we're into HAPI, which most of the data on the HAPI server, not all, but most of it is correctly, it's valid data. So we don't tend to see as many conformance errors on the HAPI server.
You mean the FHIR server?
Oh, the FHIR server, sorry, yes. Yeah, we don't see as many on the FHIR server. So if I jump back into the server page and just open up the dialog again where you enter the server details, we have a couple of other tabs here that allow you to handle different ways of authenticating and so on. So we have a request header tab. So if the particular server is maybe hidden away behind an API, you might have a key value here that you can use to access. So maybe more than one. If it's, say, using bearer token authentication, filling in these values here, like a token endpoint, client ID, and secret, might get you in. Now, this doesn't work for every server because not every server is the same, and even though most of them will use OAuth authentication, some of them require other parameters as well. So these particular sets of values will work for the Azure FHIR server. They work for MedPlum. They work for a few others. They don't yet work for GCP. There's a few extra values in there that I haven't quite worked out yet. So I'll get there eventually. It just might take a little time.
Yeah, I think this brings us to the other conversation about smartonfhir being mandated by law in almost all the US-based EHRs. And I think a lot of the major ones like Cerner, Epic, they've already adopted and they have a FHIR facade which has smartonfhir, which is just an extension of OAuth 2. What do you think about that? Do you think at any point Vanya will be able to connect to these existing EHRs like Epic and Cerner?
Yeah, I think it will. It depends on a lot of it depends on how much feedback I get from users. So the more people contact me and tell me I'm trying to connect to this particular server, I'm getting these errors, then I'll be able to work out what's required and maybe add some extra options here. The smartonfhir part might be a little more complex because there's scopes involved, so I might need to put some extra functionality in here to handle the scopes. But over time, I think this will build up slowly, and we get more and more servers and more ways of accessing the servers enabled.
It's cool, yeah. So what are your future directions? So what are other things that you're thinking about with Vanya, with things in general? What do you think?
Yeah. Well, for Vanya, the next piece of major functionality it needs, I think, is a proper query management process. So instead of just getting the last updated resources, I should be able to run a FHIR query with multiple parameters in the GET request and see a lot of, more finely granular data coming back. So I would like to see then, say, for example, if I'm getting observation records, I might have an include or a rev include to include the patient resources and practitioner resources and so on as well. So I'd like to see those in the same viewer. So two big pieces of functionality to handle there, but I think that would add a lot of extra value to developers who are writing code and want to see that data. So as we all know, FHIR resources don't exist in isolation. They're all connected to each other, and it's important to be able to see the connected resources as well. So there is some of that in Vanya at the moment, as in when I open a resource that connects to other resources, if I can find one, just one moment there. We'll try encounter. You should be able to see the interconnected resources. But we'd only see them if they're properly set up. Okay, not a great example there. Again, I come back to we're using test data. So this is what you see when you use test data. It's often in different formats and often not great to work with. So in the case of encounter here, you can see we have patient and condition and practitioner information. So this does allow me to see the conditions attached and click on them, but I can't see them all in one viewer. So there's a lot of clicking and back paging involved. So I'd like to improve on that to make the process easier for developers as a whole.
Right, and that comes back to the support for include, rev include, and all of these other more complicated search parameters.
Yes, yeah. So even though the search parameters can be complicated, the complexity really is on the server side, not on Vanya's side, because once the request is passed across, all we're doing in Vanya is rendering the results that come back. So it's complex, but more complex from a UI perspective than a functional perspective, I would say.
Right. And I'm actually just curious how you did pagination. Was it different between different server implementations?
It turned out it wasn't. Initially, I kind of got pagination wrong, like a lot of people do. So I was relying on the parameters and some of the values that come back in the next and previous links in the FHIR bundle. But that wasn't quite correct because some servers will have, say, an offset value, others will have another value that makes you think you can treat it as like you would pagination, say, in an e-commerce site. But it's not quite the same. You need to be using the full URLs for the next and previous, as in the previous URL in the bundle. So this is set up now to use those URLs correctly, and it works on all the servers I've tested it on. So pagination is working quite well. It is worth noting, though, that the total record count up here, like the 177,000, the total count parameter is not supported by every FHIR server. So in some cases, you might get a 0 or an empty field up here if the server can't manage it.
Right. There is also FHIR supports an accurate representation of the total count, and there is an approximate representation of the count.
Yeah. So I think if you had an approximate value coming back, the values up here obviously wouldn't be totally accurate, and you might hit the next button and find nothing's there.
Yeah. So something that we've found, at least when developing some of our applications, is that getting that total count in at least HapifhIR, we've seen the database API calls, that takes up 90% of the time for a response to come back.
Right. Well, yeah, which probably explains the slow loading time for the observation page, which I think took about 4 or 5 seconds to come back.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I would say that the total count is an important value to have. You're going to need to know how many records you have there. So it might be something that could be optional, maybe a little checkbox, use the total value or don't use the total value,
Yeah,
just to speed up the requests.
makes sense. Performance optimizations. Yeah.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, this is it's been a good demo actually, and I haven't really checked out the linking as much, and that's really cool to know that you're actually regarding these links as actual links to other resources and going to the resources by clicking on them. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, there are some gaps there. Like, for example, a link could be to a FHIR resource on another FHIR server, which obviously wouldn't work because we're not connected up there. But for the most part, it all works quite well. But it kind of does illustrate as well that even though certain elements in FHIR, like resource reference, allow a multitude of different types of values, like even identifiers can be there or display strings without proper resource links, that very rarely happens. Most people are using these resources in one way, not in the other ways. So even though FHIR has so many different ways of using it and so many different options, most people tend to be using it in one way.
Okay. Yeah, that's true. So I just want to, again, for the people who are checking this out, I have this right in the description below, so you can just go to vanyalabs.com and you can check out the FHIR viewer. You can download it for free. It's available, and again, you've got Darren's email right here at the bottom, so just be sure to check it out, give any feedback if you'd like, and just any sort of tooling, any sort of innovation in the FHIR space and in the digital health space has been great, especially ones that are open, because not a lot of people take the initiative. They just they think, okay, I use Postman, so what? I'll just continue using Postman. So it's really good to see a tool like this come out that can work with multiple FHIR servers and actually help people see the data that they are interacting with. And I think it may help stakeholders and people who are not developers a little bit more than people who are dealing with code every single day.
Yeah, it's I find Vanya is particularly useful, say, if we're doing demos to the business, because it's very visual and people can see data in a visual way rather than showing JSON. Like, you probably know yourself, Siddharth, that if you're doing a demo to people who are not technical, showing them Postman and a JSON response, their eyes just glaze over. So Vanya is very useful in that regard, and it's helped me a lot with demos and other devs on the team as well.
Yeah, I think like understanding that it's just data. When they see a table, they understand that it's data, but when they see JSON, they're like, that's code.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
So what are your future plans?
Well, I'll be working on Vanya a bit more next year. I intend to continue with my website, my blog, and LinkedIn as well, expanding on that. And I'm talking as well to a lot of different companies, trying to get a feel for what their pain points are with FHIR. So anyone who wants to have a chat, just let me know and we can talk about your project. So I've noticed over time that there's a lot of problems encountered by different dev teams, say at the end of the process when they reach kind of the pre-production stage. And there's not very much strong documentation in that area. So I'd like to get a better feel for what people's problems are there as well.
That's really cool. So I think I've linked your blog right here as well. So you can check out darrendevitt.com as well as vanyalabs.com, and feel free to reach out to Darren with all of your thoughts. Maybe you might need help. And Darren, anything else you would like to tell the audience before we part?
Well, I'm looking forward to FHIR arriving in Ireland because we're very much behind the curve in terms of sharing patient data. The rest of Europe is marching ahead, we're not, so hopefully that'll happen quite soon. And I'm really looking forward to seeing some better tools coming out there for developers as well in FHIR. I think it's a space that's not well served and we could do with a lot more there. So looking forward to see what's coming there as well.
I agree. And then I definitely think that leading the way by actually pushing examples out there and putting real tools that people can take and use is a huge part of pushing the ecosystem forward. So thank you, Darren, for taking the time. And that was an amazing demo of Vanya. So do check it out, and I'll put links in the description down below. So thanks again for taking the time, and I'll catch you again in the next episode.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.